Welcome to MyLife, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A gute Woche, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer Tanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC, and it is in honor and memory of Rav Yosef Halevi Weinberg, Olav Shalom, and Rav Meisha Pinchas HaKoyen Katz, Olav Shalom, and Rav Yael HaKoyen Khan, Olav Shalom. It's also in the merit and schus of Rav Zev Yecheskel and Risha Katz, Le'erich Yomim V'Shanim Tevis, for many healthy years. We finished chapter 2 in Tanya. So now, after we've covered the two forces, the two voices, the two personalities that are there within each Jew, the nefesh, harishena that he spoke about at the end of chapter 1, called the animal soul, a soul that is driven towards survival and towards filling its needs, as we shall discuss later in Tanya. But as the Alter Rebbe put it, it's rooted in klipas nega. That means in the divine that's encased in a husk, in a shell. And from there come all the negative personality traits. What he saw, the Daled Yusedus, Haroim, whether it's arrogance or jealousy or pride or laziness, depression, as he listed there, and even the positive attributes that the Gemara says that every Jew has. The Alter Rebbe spells out two of the three, Rachmanis and Geim Lechasodim, compassion and kindness. That too originates in the animal soul, because the animal soul is not evil. The animal soul, however, is focused on its needs and survival. So that is one soul and one force, one personality within us. Then in Perek Beis, the second chapter in Tanya, he explained there's a second personality, a second soul, Nefesh Hashenis B'Yisrael. And his personality is divine. Chelik Elokah Mimal Mamash, without husks, without any shells, undiluted, a pure expression of the divine, which includes, of course, the divine will and the divine purpose of existence. So here you have two forces. As we shall learn, they are in battle with each other. Who will dominate? But it's clearly two different personalities that come together inside each one of us. After establishing that we have these two, we now need to understand their composition. What is the anatomy? What is the structure of the divine soul? And what is the structure of the animal soul? So in chapter 3 begins discussing the structure of the soul. Chapters 3, 4, and 5 will talk about this structure in context of telling us that these are the tools, the instruments that we have to live up to our divine purpose. Then, in chapters 6, 7, and 8, an equal 3 chapters, the Alter Rebbe is going to then talk about the structure of the animal soul. And its driving force is to conceal the divine, is to serve itself, self-interest. And then in chapter 9, the Alter Rebbe will return and talk about how each of them have different personality and how they're in battle with each other. And then, after chapter 9, chapter 10 will be about the tzaddik that dominates the animal soul. The divine soul dominates and even eliminates the animal soul. In chapter 11, the rasha, where the animal soul is dominant. And in chapter 12 and on, the Beinoni, which is the ultimate purpose of Sefer Shel Beinim of Tanya, who is able to control and keep the animal soul at bay and tame it. But let's not jump ahead. That's the structure where we're headed. So now in chapter 3, we're going to learn about the structure and anatomy of the divine soul. Now, a few key things to make clear. In Perek Beis, in chapter 2, we learned at length that the neshama, all souls, no matter which soul, is rooted in and connected to its divine source, chelik elikam mimal mamish, which in turn manifests, as we discussed at length, in chachmosei umachshavtei yizbarach, in the mind, in the supernal mind and thought of God. And we explain why, because the neshama has to also come into existence. It can't just remain on a purely godly level. It's coming into this world ultimately, but it's carrying that divine essential personality. And Chachma is the perfect channel, because Chachma is a bridge, an interface between pure divinity, but the structure of existence. As we discussed then, Chachma is the first of the spheres, and as such it's a keli, the bittul of Chachma. Later in chapter 35, in Tanya, in the Hagah, in the gloss, the Alter Rebbe is going to explain in the name of his teacher, the Magid of Mezrich, that in Chachma, what the dominant feature of Chachma is, Hu levade ve'ein zolose, God alone and nothing else. So though on one hand it's Chachma, it's the spark of an idea, but it recognizes and is cognizant of a higher presence of the divine. So it's very fitting that the mind carries the very pure nature, the divine nature of the soul, and Hu v'chachmosei echad, as we learned, Hu hamadav hu yedeya, as Alter Rebbe cited, and according to the Ramak and the Arizal, in Atzilus, there's a unification between the divine core and the divine attributes, and thus the neshama maintains that divinity, chelik elikam mimal mamish, and its integrity as it travels downward. It continues saying that as the neshamas branch off, meaning into different levels, they still are like a child and all its components from head to toe that comes from the very core of the seed of the Father, from the seed in the mind of the Father. And the same thing in the moral, that all the details and all the aspects of every neshama, no matter what level it's at, is all rooted in Moyach Ha'av, in this case Moyach and Chachmosei Yizbarach, which is one with Hu v'Chachmosei Echad. And then even going further, no matter what soul you're talking about, even the lowest souls, even the Peish Yisrael, all have that connection. And then finally, at the end of the chapter, talked about parents and their role. And that still does not affect the very nature of the divine, even though it affects the instruments, the levush, nefesh hasichlis, nefesh habamis, as we discussed last week. Why is this introduction critical? Because now we know a neshama doesn't just have chachma. Chachma is one faculty. It's the first of 10 faculties. What about these faculties that the soul has, which is going to be its composition, its very structure? That's what we're going to address. And we'll see that these faculties are also divine, even as they turn into faculties. Not just the very personality, not just the very elements of every soul, the very pure nature of every soul, no matter what level of a soul, but also its faculties are divine and fundamentally a chelik elikam mimal mamish. So in the beginning of chapter 3, the Alter Rebbe is going to address this structure, these koiches hanefesh, the 10 faculties, as they're rooted in the 10 spheres. And the second part is going to actually spell out what they are. Not all 10, it's going to focus on Chachma Bina Das and Chesed Gvura Tiferes, which include all the other emotions. So we're going to come away in chapter 3 with not just understanding the divine soul and its divinity and its divine personality, but also how it manifests in faculties. Because at the end of the day, you can have a soul, it could be the purest soul within you. We live in a world where we have to actualize that. And that actualization comes through faculties. So you see the fascinating organization, order. We're moving from the soul now to its faculties. So let's learn inside. Inside, what does the Alter Rebbe say? The beginning of Perek Gimel, chapter 3. V'hinei, and now, kol b'chinu madrege mishalosh elu, nefesh, ruach, and neshama. Each of these three facets and levels, he says two words, b'chinu madrege, we'll speak about that in a moment. Of the three, the aforementioned three, what were they mentioned? Remember, nefesh, ruach, and neshama. He said the neshama itself is kolul, encompasses, and includes three dimensions. Nefesh, which is like the biological, or we call it the behavioral. Ruach, the emotional. And neshama, the cognitive, the intellectual. So he says, each one of these three, kol b'china madrege mishalosh elu, nefesh, ruach, and neshama. Klula, they in turn contain and encompass within them me'eser b'chinas keneged eser sfiris el yenis shenishtalshlu mehen. They contain 10 powers. B'chinas really means, as we'll discuss, 10 levels or 10 dimensions. But they refer to the 10 koiches. And why does he say the word 10 koiches? We'll discuss that. Which in turn mirror the 10 heavenly spheres. Eser sfiris al yenis shenishtalshlu mehen, from which these 10 faculties or 10 powers or 10 levels originate. But he doesn't just say the word originates, he says nishtalshlu. So every word here is precise. So the general point he's making now, he's saying now that this nefesh, ruach, neshama, we didn't discuss what the nefesh, ruach, neshama is comprised of. What are its parts? We know there's the dimension. The dimensions of nefesh, ruach, neshama. So now he's saying each one of them includes and contains eser b'chinas, which correspond to the 10 spheres. So this is the first time Tanya is introducing the concept of the 10 spheres. We spoke about it already, the 10 spheres of Atzilus, but the language of eser spheres is used now for the first time. So in order to understand this piece, we have to talk about two things. First, we'll talk about the 10 spheres, Sefiros el yenis, the divine spheres, and then we'll talk of their relationship with the 10 faculties, or what he calls the eser b'chinas. And then I'll go into the details of why he uses the word b'china, madrege, b'chinas, Sefiros el yenis. Every word in Tanya is precise and relevant to our general discussion. So let's go back to the central theme that we've been talking about. We're addressing now the divine soul, whose personality is divine. Now we're going into the very faculties of that soul. So one thing is clear. A soul on its own is shapeless and not defined, just like the divine energy on its own is undefined. Definition and structures come in the next level. When God wanted to create a structured universe, how do you create a structured universe in a way that makes sense to us? Of course, Kol Yochel, God can do anything, but he didn't want to just do anything. He wanted to do it in a way that we can understand his process and then retrace it and connect to the process. So look at Chumash. It doesn't just say God created heaven and earth. It says, Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'sa'aretz. And then he continues the process of creation. Vayemer Elokim yehi oir, vayhi oir. And day 1, God said oir. Day 2, vayemer Elokim yehi rakia. There shall be a firmament, a heaven. And so 6 days, and then the 7th day is Shabbos. Right there you have a structure, 7 days. And a creation in each day, and God utters the 10, Asara Maimoris Nivra Elam. So even though b'maymer echad yochel hibaris, he could have created all with one statement, Bereshis bara, but he did not, because he wanted a structure. And a structure requires distinctions. I, Hashem echad, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem echad. But that echad, the godliness, which is beyond any type of structure, chose to manifest the Echad through multifaceted ways. That's why in Echad we're mechaven. What's the intention when we say Echad? We say Aleph, the Achdus of Alufi Shalelam, God, Master of the universe. Ches is the seven heavens and earth, and the Dalet are the four directions, north, south, east, west. Because the point is to recognize the unity of the divine within the multitude, within the diversity. So when we look from a perspective of a superficial or a surface level, it can seem like there's many details, and there are many details. But they're all connected. They're all driven by one Echad. How do we explain this? So we discussed this when we talked about the Haggadah in chapter 2. So God created the concept of Sefiros, that the divine, the words of the Avedis HaKedesh, where he says, by Ibn Gabbai, Kishem, the Eibishter, just like he has the power to create Bli Gvul, the infinite, he has the power to create Gvul. And the first Gvul are the spheres. So the God that is beyond infinite and beyond finite, you can say beyond the number one and the beyond many, created both, two tracks, all coming from one Echad. The Esser Sefiros is the way Chassidus, based on Kabbalah, explains that we should be able to understand it. That's why they're called Sefiros Elyonos, because they're not man-made. They're godly Sefiros. They're divine Sefiros. So Chochmah is the first of the 10. Chochmah shel Yisbarach. Chochmah Yisbarach. It's divine wisdom. But then we say Chakim v'lei b'chochmah yediyah, because really God can be defined by Chochmah. That's why we have to understand both sides of it. On one hand, you can't say he does not have Chochmah. On the other hand, he's not defined by it. So we say Chakim v'lei b'chochmah yediyah. Then comes Bina, Mavin v'lei b'bina yediyah. Same idea. And then Das. And we're going to talk about all the spheres, what they are. Chochmah, Bina, Das is the three cognitive, which we'll soon discuss. Then come the seven emotions, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Chod, Yesod, Malchus. So these are now divine instruments, if you wish, divine tools, divine channels, divine attributes that express the divine in a way that we can talk about structure. But they're still completely divine. You don't call them created, you call them emanations. God imparted, Atzilus, from the word Netzal, imparted, like Hafrosha, emanates. Is God, God forbid, defined by the spheres? No. Do the spheres define God? Also not. God is not the sum of the parts. Is that he has all capacities, he has all possible capacities. He chose 10. Think of an artist that can create infinite types of art, but he chose one piece of art that's going to consist of 10 building blocks. In the Kabbalah themselves, as we've also discussed, have different opinions about but the nature of these spheres. Are they just like instruments and tools, or are they actually really divine channels? So there's disagreements on this, and Chassidus comes and reconciles that all the opinions are correct. It all depends on which level you're talking about. On one hand, the spheres are nothing but divine expressions. On the other hand, they do have an element of structure. What that structure is not the place to go into right now. But suffice it to say, this is a big discussion in Kabbalah among Kabbalists and Chassidus of understanding these spheres. But these are the spheres. Do we pray to the spheres? God forbid. We pray to God. A love, a love to God. A love to you, to God himself, to him. Not to his attributes. But his attributes are an extension, an expression of him. He is one with his expression, because you can't, God forbid, separate between God and his expression. And the same thing with all the spheres. He's one with these spheres. That's why in Atzilus we say, you are one with your energies, the energy of the attributes, the soul of the attributes, so to speak. and one with the containers, the expression of the attributes, the structure of the attributes. That's how the Alter Rebbe teaches it later in Ageres HaKedah Siman Chof, Epistle, the section 20. The Alter Arizal teaches Chayu is on the Moichin, Garmu is on the Midas. But regardless, it's all about a unification, that he is one with his attributes, like we learned in the last chapter. Hu v'chachmasei echad. Though we don't understand it, because le machshavei sechem, as he said, but that we know. Now you'll say, I just explained out according to logic and structure, that structure is understood. So how do we say we don't understand? Whatever we can understand, the Eibishter wants us to understand. That which remains somewhat elusive, like how is God one with these attributes? That is plenty of explanation on that, but still some of it will remain because we can't really fully experience what the divine is like. So just like he's one with Chachmas, he's also one with other spheres. So then you could ask the question, so why are you saying here that the soul, the faculties are rooted in the 10 spheres? When you said that the Neshama is rooted in Chachmas Baruch, which is one, because Chachmas Baruch is the core, everything begins from Chachmas. It's the seed. In the example, the seed of the father, the Tipas Mayach, that originates from the mind of the father, the Chachma, and it includes all the structure, all the spheres, all the faculties that will emerge from it. So when you talk about the very soul, the soul is rooted in the first of the spheres, Chachma. Without rooted, it's actually rooted higher. We said it's Nimshach, if you recall. It travels through Chachmasei Machshavti Yisbarach, but it's rooted all the way in Chelik Elikam Mal Mamish. Then through Chachma, it manifests, now it has an identity, but it's still Chachma. And then the faculties that we're talking about will evolve from there. And that's the second part of the statement. So after saying that we know now the Sefiros Elyonis, so now he's saying the Nefesh Ruach Neshama, that level includes and contains 10 faculties which mirror and originate from these 10 spheres. So this is the next step. Not only did Eibishter create and emanate in a structure of 10 spheres, which are the 10 main building blocks. Think of it as the spiritual DNA of all of existence. But furthermore, he created a human being, B'Tselem Elokim, in the divine image. Like we said, the Neshama is rooted, Vayipach Ba'apov Nishmas Chayim, rooted in the very core of the divine. And also its faculties mirror and reflect and originate from the 10 spheres. Because you could have had a situation where, you know what? The Neshama is a chelik alikam mamash, but now it's given tools. Just like you come with a shovel, or with a screwdriver, or with a pick, or with a hammer. The hammer is not part of the divine elements. These are tools, how you actualize and build something in this world. But we're saying not that. The Tzelem Elikim, the soul, that is a chelik alikam mamash, and mamish, which also means that it comes in a mamoshis, in a tangible way, also expresses itself in the faculties. That the faculties are not just reflecting. Like when you say, for example, the creation of the world, everything comes from the 10 spheres. Fire originates from Gvura. Chesed from Mayim, water, fire from Gvura, water from Chesed. But you don't say Nishtalshel, you don't say that it is actually those spheres as they've nishtalshlu and evolved here. What you say is it originates from there, but it's a nivra, it's a creation. When it comes to the neshama, he's saying an expression that's keneged esespheres elyenis shenishtalshlu mehem. It both mirrors and reflects and evolves. What's a ishtalshlus? Ishtalshlus is like a shalshelis, a chain. When you look at a chain, each rung is connected to the previous rung. So it's not just corresponding, like an archetype. You could say, Chesed is the archetype from which originates water. Gvura is the archetype from which originates fire. We're saying more than archetype. We say it's like links in a chain, with one link connecting to a higher link, to a higher link. Obviously, it manifests on lower levels, and ultimately, the faculties that we have, that you and I have, the 10 faculties, which we'll soon discuss in chapter 3, actually are connected link by link all the way to the 10 spheres in Atzilus. And when you learn Chassidus, you learn the spheres go all the way up to the Esser Spheres Agnuzis, according to the interpretation of Chassidus, before the Tzimtzum, how God is envisioning these 10 attributes. But in Atzilus, as we learned in chapter 2, is where it manifests in a structural way. It's divine. Those divine spheres, Spheres Alienis, are the actual root. And they manifest, not like a creation. What I said is like an archetype than a manifestation, but an actual manifestation of the very divine nature of the Esser Spheres Alienis. In the language of Tanya, Esser B'chinas connected Esser Spheres Alienis Shenishtalshel Mehen. Okay. So let's now focus a bit more on the language that's used here. Why does the Alter Rebbe use the language Esser B'chinas connected Esser Spheres? Why does he say Esser Keiches? So I have not seen a particular interpretation of it, but most likely, which seems apparent when you look at it, is because he doesn't want to talk about the faculty as a defined faculty right now. He's talking as 10 dimensions. The word B'china is dimension. Indeed, there's actually a Maimer from the Alter Rebbe, in the Maimorim Ketzorim, the short Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe, that asks, why do we use the word B'china in Kabbalah? Why don't you just say Keser, Chochma, Bina? Why B'chinas Keser, B'chinas Chochma, B'chinas Bina? It's also discussed in Ayin Beis in volume 2, chapter 336. And he explains, because B'china is a term used when you're not talking about physical structure. When you're talking about something that has a physical distinction, let's say 5 fingers on your hand. So that's a madrega. There's the thumb, there's the index finger. We'll talk about it. You'll see the word madrega in the beginning. I'll get back to it shortly. That's a madrega. B'china is because in spiritual levels, you can't really talk about black and white distinctions. Things are encompassed within each other. So b'china is used like sometimes in Yiddish they say a probe, a test, a measure. When you say that, let's say a piece of gold, how pure is it? This is the example that Alter Rebbe uses, a piece of gold. How pure is it? So you say it has 10 parts gold and 10 parts sigim that are like some waste, dross. So it's a way of measuring something. Now you don't see it. When you look at it, you just see a piece of gold. Same thing here in the Sefiros. When you talk about the Sefiros, you see Chochma, Bina, but they're all encompassed with one another. So B'china is when you're using it in a more subtler form, you say the B'china, the measure of it, the dimension of it. Madrega would be used when you're really defining it more as a particular level. So what he's using here, Esser B'chinas, because he's saying before they become faculties, they're really 10 measures, they're 10 dimensions that are evolving from and reflect the 10 spheres, and then in turn, ultimately become our faculties. Due to time limits, we're going to stop here. And we're going to continue discussing why he says in the beginning of the chapter, Kol B'chinu Madrege. He says both expressions. And then we'll continue learning inside. All these classes, the shiurim, can be found at tanyaapplied.com. And you could also submit any question you like. Have a good tavach, and everyone be well.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit chasidusapplied.com for archived classes and more resources.